Hi, Saints. It's Kent again, doing a recap for our Sermon on the Mount Bible study. This time we're recapping the 5th week of our study, where we looked at Matthew 5:17 and 18. Just a little simple statement Jesus made where he said that he has not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill them. And so we're going to just take a few minutes to look at what we found about those two words, abolish and fulfill, and what Jesus meant by both, and how that should affect the remainder of our study going through the Sermon on the Mount. So I'll just go ahead and read that passage real quick, just those two verses. Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So if you remember earlier, a few weeks ago, when we were looking at the context for the Sermon on the Mount, we noticed the difference between John's ministry and Jesus' ministry, and how John's was much more targeted to the nation of Israel, but Jesus's had begun to expand to include some of the more Gentile influenced areas. And Matthew, the writer, tells us that for a reason. It's because when Jesus' ministry continues to expand, it's not just to the nation of Israel. Now it is in his earthly life where he says, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But at the end of his ministry, after he's been crucified, after he's been resurrected, right as he's ascending to heaven, he says, make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey all the things I've commanded you. So what he told the Jewish disciples in his own day, he tells them to tell all the nations. So the teachings that Jesus gives are just as true and just as applicable to us, his Gentile disciples, as they were to his Jewish disciples when he originally gave them. However, with that in mind, we have to remember that Jesus was Jewish, and the 12 disciples that he was talking to in the Sermon on the Mount were Jewish, and so there's a Jewish kind of context, there's a Jewish kind of backdrop to most of what Jesus is saying. He'll talk about when you offer your gift at the altar. It's like a Gentile might not have any frame of reference for what he's talking about. It's given kind of in a Jewish context. And so we do remember that it was given in a Jewish context, but what he's saying does apply to believers of all nations. So when we come to his actual teaching, then it would make sense if he's talking in a Jewish context to Jewish disciples, that he would it would be incumbent upon him to address what had been spoken by God before, namely the law of Moses and the prophets, i.e. the Old Testament. What had God said before, and what am I saying now? And if you'll notice, there's two phrases in the Sermon on the Mount where he says that, the law and the prophets. One of them is right here in Matthew 5:17, do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. The other is in Matthew 7:12, the so-called golden rule. And everything, therefore, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, for this is the law and the prophets. If you notice, this first one is right here at the beginning of the sermon. He'd given some introductory words, we call the Beatitudes, his warning about being salt and also being light that we looked at last time. But then immediately as he's kind of starting the ethical teachings, like the portion of his sermon that's not introduction, it's like, here's what I'm calling you to do. It starts with the law and the prophets. And then as we go toward the end, the next time he says the law and the prophets, it's kind of the conclusion of that ethical teaching. Now he does say some things afterwards about, enter by the narrow gate and build your house on the rock. But those things would kind of be, just like the Beatitudes are kind of the introduction, those things are kind of the conclusion of the sermon. The real meat of the sermon, where he's giving his ethical teachings, are all kind of bookended by law and the prophets, law and the prophets. So we can kind of look at those two statements as kind of bookends for Jesus' ethical teaching. And he's addressing, what am I saying, and how does it compare or even contrast with what was said before? And we're going to look at that in just a moment. Similar to what we saw last time with the salt and light, I think that there's two warnings that Jesus is giving, two potential errors that his hearers could fall into. And the first is addressed by that phrase, do not think I've come to abolish. the Greek word is really strong. It means like to destroy, to kind of like an enemy combatant would destroy a castle or something. Do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. There were some early heretical groups in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries called the Gnostics, specifically a group called the Manichaeans, who were a Gnostic heresy, who taught that Jesus came to abolish the Old Testament, to abolish what had been said by Moses, said by the prophets, basically that the God they were serving is different and antagonistic toward the God that Jesus was serving. And like Matthew and Jesus, Matthew describing what Jesus said is trying to preempt that error. No, do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I am serving God my Father, who is the God of Israel. The law and the prophets were given by God, and I'm not here to oppose God. I'm not here to oppose what was given by God. In our day, that error is not nearly as common as it seems as it was then. If you have anybody saying anything negative about the Old Testament, they're probably not doing it from a quote-unquote Christian perspective. It's like a lot of atheists and people who are opposing Christianity will oppose the God of the Old Testament. But it's not very common for somebody to be saying, no, I'm serving Jesus and he's antagonistic to the law of Moses. But the other side that I think we can fall off on is more common today. And that's where Jesus says, I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And that word fulfill is usually used in context with prophecy, like this fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. It can also mean just to complete, to kind of finish the sentence and put a period on it. I've come to complete the law and the prophets. So the error Jesus would be warning about there is thinking of him as merely a scribe of the law, saying, I'm just come to clarify to you in my teaching what Moses really meant, or what Isaiah the prophet was actually saying. Like, what are these guys getting at? I'm the best of the scribes. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, I've come to complete, to fulfill, to finish the law of Moses. The authority that he was claiming for himself there cannot be overstated. In fact, if you remember, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, 28 and 29, says the crowds were astonished at his teaching because he spoke as one with authority and not as the scribes. Like, this guy isn't debating interpretations of the law of Moses. If you notice, anybody who's referencing the law of Moses or referencing any of the Old Testament prophets, including Jesus when he does that, they'll say, it is written. Like, it was said to Moses, like Moses had him on tablets of stone by the finger of God himself, so it is written. Or they would be quoting the prophets who would say, thus says the Lord. Like, Isaiah doesn't say, hey, I've got a thought here, guys. He says, the Lord is saying this. Jeremiah is like, the word of the Lord came to me. Jesus doesn't use either of those phrases. He doesn't say, it is written, nor does he say, thus says the Lord. Again and again in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, I say to you. Like, you're aware the ancients were told, but I say to you. And you can imagine the hearers saying, who is this guy? Who does he think he is to say, yes, Moses taught this, but I say this? Like, Moses got the law directly from God. What Jesus is saying is, yeah, he did. I am God himself. My words alone carry the authority that the tablets of stone had, that Moses received. I have a new people with a new calling, and I'm giving them new commands. I'm not just reinterpreting what Moses said to the ancient Israel. That's not what's going on. I'm not Moses coming down from the mountain with a word from the Lord. I am the Lord. I am the one who spoke to Moses. I am the one who Moses got his authority from. And so I don't have to say, look, what I'm saying is true. Look at what Moses or look at what the prophets said. I'm saying Moses and the prophets were just pointing their way to me. All of what was said through them finds its fulfillment in me. I say to you. That's very important, because even among really good Christian commentaries, a lot of times you'll see them fall into this pattern. It's like, well, Jesus wasn't really saying anything different than what Moses said, or Jesus wasn't really saying anything beyond what the prophets were saying. And Jesus saying, oh, I absolutely am. And I have every right and authority to do so, because I am the God who gave the law. I am the one who was speaking through Jeremiah. And now I am saying to you this. And we're going to see that that's a very important thing to realize, because as we get to the specifics of Jesus' teaching, when he's talking about the commands of the law, sometimes he expands greatly on them. Like the law says, don't commit adultery. I say to you, it's lust in your heart. The law says murder, or I say to you, anger. And he's going to expand greatly on what the law said. But there's even going to be times where the law was telling the Israelites, this is the regulation for you, but I'm saying to you, my disciples, this is the regulation for you, and it's actually different. It's something entirely unique and separate from what the law said. And an ancient Israelite might be saying, but Jesus, who are you to have authority to say this? Moses is the one who gave us these laws. He's saying, I'm greater than Moses. I'm the one who gave Moses his authority. And the crowds were amazed at his authority with which he spoke, because he wasn't speaking as a scribe. He wasn't correcting other scribes and rightly interpreting what was written in the Old Testament. He's bringing something profoundly new, something that was a command to his people as a command from God, no less than what the ancient Israelites received from Moses. So over the next several weeks, we're going to be looking at from some specific commands that Jesus gives to his disciples, and for each of them, for the rest of chapter 5, he's either comparing or even contrasting them with what was given in the Old Testament law. So looking forward to getting those to you over the next couple weeks. Looking forward to that. See you then.